Hey, welcome to the Ron Jonson Discipleship Podcast.
We're so glad you tuned in this week. We're always excited to be with you. We love your feedback as we continue to help bring some moral clarity in a culture that is full of all kinds of confusion right now. We've talked about this. It's kind of a brave new world out there where you wake up and the headlines each day cause you just to scratch your head and go, what in the world is going on? And how are people coming to these kind of conclusions? And we're putting forth what kind of legislation and what are we trying to teach our kids? And I mean, it's just amazing how people are just stunned at the rapidity of the social change around us. And today, as we get into here shortly, we're going to answer a lot of questions for people because really we're living in a world that is largely influenced by a major theorist who many folks are not familiar with, but it will help bring clarity as to why things are so crazy.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to understand where we're coming from, to see where the trend, or at least where the policymakers are going, and how we can stop it, and what are the opposing forces, what are counter arguments.
Right.
To kind of have a bird's eye view.
Absolutely. And when
construct.
you hear these things or things put forth or certain agendas driven by certain groups of people, all of a sudden you realize, oh, okay, I know what they're doing. I know why they think that way, because it's so foreign to our Christian worldview.
Yeah, we're getting the playbook. The enemy's playbook,
exactly.
basically. Yeah.
And then you go, that's where they're coming
You guys
from.
are like, what are you guys talking about? We'll get to specifics.
Absolutely. We'll flesh this out.
We'll flesh this out.
But hey, even before we get into the topic of today, we wanted to bring you up to speed on a lot of important things going on. You know, this Sunday, I was trumpeting this in the message on Sunday, how important it is for Christians who are in the marketplace, which is like everybody, especially those who are running businesses and have the power to implement a kingdom culture, Christian values, Christian principles into the marketplace. It's time really to rally together and to get some support and get a common vision, and that's what Market Share is all about. So we got an exciting Market Share coming up Saturday morning.
This coming Saturday, 8 o'clock. We're going to have a breakfast fellowship together. This is where we get to hang out, get to know each other, get to know what kind of gifts and businesses you're a part of or you own or whatnot. But we're talking about an important topic. We're talking about how do you normalize a feedback culture. Feedback culture is the key to getting better. And we often see feedback as something that's negative or contentious. It doesn't have to be that way. Having a great feedback culture is a kingdom culture. And this is so important for us in the marketplace because, all the stuff we're talking about here is basically someone laying out their principles for their kingdom that they're building. And when we get to be in the marketplace, whether you're a business owner or you're just a leader or whatever territory, dominion, you could be a frontline worker, you have given the opportunity, stewardship, to lay out God's kingdom in whatever dominion you do have. And that's why it's so important for us in the workplace, in the marketplace, to think through and say, how can I bring God's glory? Because to counter everything, because everyone else is bringing their kingdom, are we as Christians bringing God's kingdom to what we do every day?
Right. Well, that's good. And the whole posture of humility that simply says, I don't know it all. I need feedback. I have blind spots. I welcome your input in my life because I know if you're coming and say, Pastor, I really need to talk to you about that message on Sunday. I'm not going to, what do you mean by that? I mean, because I know you love me, you value me, and I know that whatever you're going to share is going to be important. It's an important perspective, but many people don't view it that way, and it's a threat when you start speaking into my life.
Positioning yourself to normalize feedback in your culture is such a kingdom principle because you're saying ultimately, I am not God. I am not the king. God is the king, and God used people, especially trusted people or people in my leadership team, people who are surrounded in my life, who I love and know me, to give me feedback so I can grow.
That's good.
It's a kingdom posture.
That's good. So they're going to get a bagel and great feedback and great fellowship.
Yes, absolutely.
8 o'clock.
8 o'clock. Come on out to Livingstone Church. Yes.
Awesome. Yes, and I set a record on Sunday. I'm so proud of myself. I set a record for the shortest sermon series title in the history of Pastor Ron Jonson Jr.'s preaching.
Yeah, it's on par with the Jesus verse, I wept, It's
shorter than that.
It's shorter than that, yeah.
It's simply called Me, but
the subtitle makes it
in Jonathan Edwards' style. I do have a big subtitle, but I think it's a good subtitle. It's called Finding Your Real Identity in a Culture of Self-Deception. And it really piggybacks on this. This, of course, is we're diving into a cultural, treatment of how we got to where we are today, but it deals with philosophy and psychology and those types of things. Whereas on Sunday morning, we're really focusing on the theological aspects of who we are, where we find our identity, and really how we live the best life.
Yeah.
And so I really encourage people. We started the series on Sunday with our opening volley. Got a lot of great feedback because we're really speaking to all kinds of issues that people are confronted with every single day, and in an increasing manner in the marketplace.
Absolutely.
And so I encourage you to tune into that if you miss Sunday and kind of get caught up. We're talking today in our ongoing covering of this book, Strange New World. The topic was called Sexualizing Psychology, Politicizing Sex. And I think everybody can relate today. Like, you wake up, you're trying to raise your family, and you realize, why in the world am I bombarded with sexual images and thoughts and messaging 24/7, round the clock? And even, to our kids, it's like you go, wait a minute, how did this planet get so sexualized? This is not the way, like I talked to my parents, they were raised in the 50s, and they were like, man, it wasn't like this at all. It was so wholesome. It was, you could go out and play. You weren't worried about your kids. You can watch whatever. It just, and now it's completely sexualized. And from our worldview, we step back and we go, how could something so intimate, an act so intimate, reserved between a man and a woman in the most intimate setting and the most intimate expression, become so public?
Yeah. And
we're going to try to answer that question today. But talk about the shift between, again, sex as a behavior and sex as an identity, because this is a fundamental, profound shift that we are confronting today.
And I think that's the problem most of us don't understand, because it's a subtle shift from behavior to identity.
So we used to say, oh, they're going to have sex. That means they're going to engage in a physical activity.
Yeah, it's something you do, right? But throughout the cultural trends, through the sneakiness of ideology, they sneak in through commercials and movies and policies and whatnot, and changing languages and changing. We see a lot of that around here, right? The definition of recession. Everything's being changed. The definition is being changed. Next thing you know, like out of nowhere, all of a sudden, your sexual preferences, your sexual desires becomes part of your deepest sense of who you are, your identity.
So for us to say, hey, it's wrong to behave in such and such way sexually based on a biblical morality is now viewed as bigotry, because really what that's being interpreted as is you're attacking me, you're attacking my identity, when we're saying, no, we're not attacking your identity, we're attacking your behavior.
Right.
What you're doing is wrong before the Lord. Right. And then people today say, well, I can't be separated from my identity, and my behavior cannot be separated. That's a massive shift in how we used to view people, selfhood, identity, and certainly sexuality.
And we were just talking about this earlier before the podcast, when someone makes a statement like, I'm a heterosexual, even that phrase that I am a heterosexual, or he is a homosexual, or whatever it is, we're buying into that language of it. Instead of saying, I practice this, or that's my behavior. When you identify as a heterosexual, when you make that statement, you're tying to sexual behaviors into your identity. Right. So unknowingly, we all just buy into that language, that world, by our verbiage, by these words that's been created.
Right, and we caution people, on Sunday, you got to watch the language that we use, because when we pick up the vernacular of a worldview that is diametrically opposed to Christianity, you're buying into those assumptions without even knowing it. And so much of the language today, like my daughter was talking about how she was sharing with a Christian friend at a Christian college, and the girl was kind of, she was wishy-washy on her understanding of biblical sexuality. She has a friend who's gay. And so she loves her friend, and her friend is gay. And so, and as Caroline and I were talking about this, we said, here's the problem. Gay is an identity. Gay says, this is who I am, this is how I was born. That's not a biblical construct at all. So we have to attack even the words that we use, because they're not coming from a biblical understanding. They're actually coming from a very secularized, godless understanding, to where gay becomes the way you are, or the way God even made you, is the way some people refer to it, and it's just simply not lining up with biblical language at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what causes part of the confusion. So we're going to talk about today a major thinker, a major philosopher, who is still probably shaping American culture more than any other philosopher. We talked about Rousseau, we talked about Nietzsche, we talked about Marx. All of these are big players in today's culture. But Sigmund Freud is alive and well everywhere in America. And we're going to talk about a couple major ideas that he introduced that help us understand why we are where we are today. The first one is this. He believed that sex was foundational to human happiness. Talk about the logic there. So everybody lives to pursue pleasure or happiness and to avoid pain. I mean, you got to be a sick person to be pursuing pain, right? So I think we can all agree we all want to be happy. And there's nothing the matter with that. Everybody wants to be happy. I think the question is, how does one find happiness? And that's what Freud was trying to talk about.
And I think the book talks about Thomas Jefferson, even in the Declaration of Independence, wrote,
life, liberty,
and the pursuit of happiness. So life, liberty, these are intrinsic rights, identity rights, God-given rights that we've been given by God, which the government is supposed to protect, right? So this is where the government and the politicians comes in: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But then they draw on that. So identity now is tied into your happiness or pursuit of happiness. What is happiness? Well, Freud then connects that pursuit of happiness to ultimate happiness to sexual pleasure,
right?
Purely like sexual, like the action of sex, like carnal.
Genital eroticism.
Yeah, that's what he says. Yeah.
So the happy person will be the sexually fulfilled person. So the more sex you're having, for Freud, the more fulfilled and happy you're going to be. Now, this is an important issue to talk about, because you have to ask the question: well, what does the Bible teach about that? Does the Bible encourage us to find happiness and pleasure? And I would say yes. Yep. But the difference is, what is going to bring you lasting happiness and lasting pleasure? How about this? What's going to bring you the maximum amount of pleasure eternally? Yeah. And you and I talked about this as it relates, for instance, to say marriage. You're dissatisfied with your wife, you're frustrated, things aren't clicking, the bedroom's gone cold, and all of a sudden you fall into a trap and you have a one-night stand with somebody at work. And so momentarily you're happy because you're fulfilling your identity, which is to be a sexual person.
According to Freud, yeah.
And yet you're going to go home and your marriage is going to blow up and your family's going to blow up and your children are going to be living in a home now that's been broken. And so you ask the question, was that one night stand seeking sexual gratification, genital eroticism? How'd that work out for you in the long term? And then we haven't even talked about eternity. Of course, Freud didn't believe in God. Freud was not a Bible-embracing person. Freud did not believe in eternal life. Yeah. So none of those things mattered in his theory. But we talked about, pleasure is important. The Bible says, at the Lord's right hand is pleasure forevermore. Yeah. So we should be seeking maximum pleasure as believers, but not erotic pleasure, but life pleasure, total pleasure in pleasing the Lord, which has been the basic Christian value, is we live not for sexual pleasure, but we live for the glory of God. And certainly that includes, in a marital life, that includes sexual pleasure. There's nothing wrong with sexual pleasure.
Biblically, it's a component of your overall pleasure, the sexual pleasure, in a confined, restrained way within marriage, because there's so many factors that ties into pleasure. Like, why not, if carnal pleasure is all you seek for, then take cocaine or heroin or whatever people, that's what people do. That's what people fall into, right? But like you said, how long lasting is that pleasure when you're addicted to some, lethal drug, right? So the idea from Freud is like, to say ultimate pleasure is found in sexual expression is so short-sighted and so limiting, and it doesn't apply to real world life, because how happy are people we minister to who, had an affair or whatever, and now their kids can't stand them, and their wives, they're estranged and they're older, and just, we see this brokenness all over, and we're like, this world doesn't work.
But this is a huge philosophical link, because you go from Rousseau, whom we talked about a few weeks ago, who basically said individual self-expression is the way to happiness. Just be yourself, be authentic. Pursue the desires of your heart, create yourself. Yeah. That's a broader kind of picture. Freud narrows that down and basically says, no, yourself is sexual. You are sexual
Right.
at the core of who you are, and therefore, not to be able to fully express your sexuality is what is harmful.
Right.
And that is America today. So Freud is all around us. He's screaming.
And even that idea is ties into major industries, pornography industries, other industries, whatever, sexual, these counselors, therapists, or whatever, and just drugs.
How many of you have been sitting around watching television with your kids, and all of a sudden an erectile dysfunction commercial comes on, and you're talking about the little blue pill, and your kid's going, "What is erectile dysfunction?" And you're like, "Why am I being hit with it?" Because here's what it is: it's we're pursuing perpetual sexual expression.
It ties into this narrative. This is the joy. This is what the key to joy and pleasure and a lasting, fulfilled, perfect life is. All these different dimensions. So those are more and more open, more and more less boundaries and restraints because of Mr. Freud.
Yep, Mr. Freud.
Yeah.
Here's another thing where Mr. Freud is screaming. How many of you parents have been absolutely appalled that we have school systems? In fact, this was the big thing with the whole "Don't Say Gay," which was, of course, a farcical campaign. When Florida and when Governor DeSantis basically passed legislation saying you're not going to be teaching sexual content, sexualized curriculum, LGBT-driven ideology to our kindergartners in the state of Florida. Now, any parent in their right mind, at least if you're coming from a Christian worldview, you'd be saying, what business does public education have in teaching my kids about sexuality, let alone what business do they have teaching my kindergartner about LGBT ideology? We're appalled by these things. And then when you saw school boards being brought to account by parents, and parents being attacked by the FBI, as being terrorists, you're going, what is the matter? Or how about this fashionable craze today where we invite drag queens, men dressed up like women, to come in and read storybooks to children in public libraries? You're going, what kind of absolute perversion and craziness is taking place here? Like, why are we exposing our innocent children to sexual topics like this that are completely age inappropriate? So what would be Freud's take on this? Because the reason all this is happening is Freud.
Yeah, well, he's thinking liberation. We want to liberate these kids so they can be sexually free and be able to express themselves, and because that's the core of who they are. This is
well, it goes even, like you're touching on here, it goes even deeper than that, because what Freud's saying is, it's not just once you reach puberty that now all of a sudden sex becomes on the radar. Freud's saying that infants, from when they're born, they are sexual creatures. He saw, for instance, a baby nursing. That was sexual. Sucking your thumb, that's sexual. All kinds of strange development processes taking place, all rooted in sexual identity. Again, much of this has been discredited, at least from a scientific standpoint. But this, for Freud, everything from the womb to the tomb was about sex. And so if that child is sexual, even as an infant, it is not inappropriate when they're in kindergarten to start talking to them about sexual things, because in Freud's mind, they're already sexual creatures. Yeah. And so, again, we look at this going, what is the problem? And Freud identified two problems in his day with public education. The first one was what he called the retardation of sexual development in kids. In other words, we weren't talking about sex early enough and often enough with our kids. The second thing Freud said was a problem is the introduction of religious viewpoints in the curriculum too early in the life of these kids. Basically, that religion was something that was going to mess them up.
Yeah.
But let's talk about Freud's view of religion for a moment. He used two I words to describe religion. Number one, infantile. What does he mean by infantile?
Yeah, it's immature. It's a construct. It's for no.
You'll grow. Yeah. Mature people grow out of the need for it. It's infantile. It's childish. The other I word was illusionary. So people embrace all of these false and fake ideas about a God, about eternal life, about morality, but it's all illusionary. None of it's real. But interestingly enough, Freud saw a public, I guess, a positive side to religion. And in fact, he believed it had a necessary role in creating civilization, which is kind of strange. But talk a little bit about that. Help our listeners understand. Like, what was his view? He hated religion. He hated the church. He hated the Bible. He hated biblical morality. But in a strange way, he saw the need for it.
Yeah, I don't fully understand this. I'm trying to comprehend his mind. Basically, he saw that the sexual drive is the essential nature of every person. But that drive without constraints can lead to destruction. Just go around pillaging and doing whatever they want.
Raping, whatever.
Yeah.
Taking advantage of other people.
Right.
So strangely enough, he recognized that religion and morality that comes from the Bible placed a harness on people and allowed us to have a civilized society where people weren't just running around raping and pillaging, as you said. But that leaves people with a sense of discontentment.
That's this word, discontentment. So it's a trade-off. To be part of civilization, you have to trade off some of your desires for morality. So
here you are, man. You're a young man, and all you think about is sex, and you want to have sex, but you can't act on just your drives. And so now we're encouraging, hey, well, join a softball league, or
go work out,
go
to church,
go to church, or do something. In other words, the whole purpose of all these other things was just simply to put a curb on your sexual appetite. Now it's interesting. I've been married now for 38 years. You're a married man. I just find that God's wired men and women differently. My wife is not sitting around 24/7 thinking about sexual activity, nor does virtually any woman on planet Earth is she wired that way. In other words, sex is not all-encompassing. Now, you talk to a 20-year-old guy, and he's probably thinking about sex a little bit more because that drive is a godly drive. It is a good thing. But my point is, there's even a difference. If I find it interesting, Freud has this theory as a man, but I don't know that I've ever seen a woman theorist that says all she thinks about all day long is sexual expression. So it's even interesting. They're looking at the genders, but nevertheless, Freud said, hey, religion, it's an illusion, it's infantile, but it serves a purpose. It helps us at least have a society where everybody, where the biggest and the strongest guy's not running around with a harem, using and abusing women. Right. But anyway, it was a very dark view of civilization.
Existence, a tension point. There's always tension.
So the reason Freud's office is full of people that he's counseling is because they're having a hard time dealing with managing their underlying sexual drives.
That's how he sees the world. That's how he sees every problem. It's sexually related, right?
I get it. You're sexually repressed. That's a problem. You're dealing with guilt and shame. Let's free you from guilt and shame and find a better outlet for you to sublimate your neurotic desires for more sex.
So even those words, sexual repression, comes from Freud.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Which, again, we hear those terms all the time, right?
Yeah. We talked about this in the message on Sunday. I get so sick and tired. Every time you disagree with somebody, they call you some phobe. You're a homophobe. You're an Islamophobe. You're a transphobe. I mean, there's whatever you disagree with somebody else's position, you get phobe put on the end of a word. Well, that's Freudian. Freud was all about phobias. In other words, these were irrational fears that people had that many times they weren't, there was at the subconscious level, right? So even the idea of the subconscious, we hear this talked about a lot. A Freudian slip, right? You say something, it didn't really mean to say it. All of this comes from Freud's psychoanalytic theory.
Yeah, you're saying there's a repressed level that you're not really aware of, and those ignorance or those fears, repressed fear of the unknown. That's why we all need to be educated, enlightened. We all need to be trained and go to re-education camps or whatever it is to overcome these. I mean, all those verbiage, that way of thinking, comes from the construct.
Well, we look at certain behaviors that the Bible, for instance, says God's not happy with, and God even uses strong language for some of the behaviors. The language is an abomination. That's a strong word. Freud would call that simply a matter of personal taste. He said it was, since there is no God, morals are simply aesthetics. It's whatever you like or dislike. And he gives an interesting example. He says, what's the difference between kissing a young woman's lips or is sharing her toothbrush. Now, with one we view with delight, the kiss. The other one we would go, oh, I don't want to share a toothbrush with somebody. And so he used that as an example of disgust that really is irrational and non-scientific, because if you kiss the girl, you have the same germs as using her toothbrush, and yet one we think is sexy and attractive and desirable, and the other we think is disgusting.
Right.
So he viewed if I view a certain sexual expression as with disgust, it's my problem. It's because it's my personal taste. It has nothing to do with the innate rightness or wrongness. It's all about aesthetics.
So everything is reduced to taste. Everything is reduced to aesthetics.
And so today,
It's
if we say, well, that's
superficial.
wrong. We say that's wrong. You say, oh, well, that's just your personal taste. That's your personal feeling. I happen to find pleasure in it. I think it's great.
Yeah.
So everything is a matter of personal taste. Which again, how do you live in a world where everything is a matter, or is reduced to a matter of aesthetics?
It sounds, on the superficial level, it sounds loving or tolerant. But if you dig into the core root of that philosophy, it just causes chaos and destruction, which is what we have in the world today.
It's unlivable.
Yeah.
So for instance, he says morality is simply a matter of cultural taste. It's about aesthetics. It's simply a necessary evil for social life to exist, which is a strange view of morality. That basically we're all running around being neurotic because we can't really be the sexual predators that we want to be.
It's all social construct. Everything's social construct and nothing's transcendent. Then we're in big trouble. Yeah. That's all I gotta say.
So let's finally here. I don't know how much time we got left. Let's take the last jump.
Okay.
Because we've moved from the realm where the real you is not just free to be authentically you, but the real you is a sexual you. And so if the real you it cannot be separated from the sexual you, the sexual self, then we must involve government. We must involve politics, because now the role of government is to make sure, by punishing people and by promoting certain things, make sure your sexual self can find public expression. So we wonder today, why is everything, well, like, look at where all the battle lines are being fought in Washington. I mean, we're talking about transgenderizing the military. We're talking about hate crimes. We're talking about, there's massive battles right now between religious liberty and sexual expression.
Not just religious liberty, First Amendment, all First Amendment right, free speech.
Oh, absolutely.
Free speech.
Yeah. So why is it that everything politically is now sexual? Like, how has sexuality become just one with politics? I mean, even the marriage debates, right? Yeah. Same-sex marriage. What about what's going on right now with abortion in America? Everything is sexual, and this is Freud. I mean, welcome again. Freud is still speaking to us. He's still in the halls of Congress.
It's interesting because people are like, oh, there's separation of church and state. Basically separation of the official church government. Official government with some type of religious institution, organized religious institution, which is what Thomas Jefferson referred to. It's not in the Constitution, it's in a letter from Thomas Jefferson. But that concept of separation of church and state is now, in many ways, violated because the government is adopting the Church of Freud. Is adopting his philosophical, his religious views on the world and worldview, and basically imposing on the rest of the culture who might not subscribe to that religion. And that's the horror we're talking about today. That's why there's such chaos.
And that's why we said before, everybody's religious. Everybody has a worldview. It's not just you Christian folks that are religious. Freudians are incredibly religious in what they espouse to be reality and true. They're just as opinionated about life and reality as we are.
This idea that at the core nature of who we are is a sexual expression, that sounds religious to me, man. That sounds philosophical. No, this is not like, hey, I saw empirical data, and
but that is the point, though. Freud shrouded all of his language and all of his theory. Where Rousseau was more romantic and more artistic, Freud came at it from a pseudoscientific perspective.
Right.
So he say, when a child masturbates, that is a very natural, normal thing, and it was all put under the guise of scientific study, as opposed to
it's like Alfred Kinsey. It's the same shroud of all these scientific things. Again, that's why science itself becomes so.
Well, science becomes a religion.
It becomes it's a philosophy, a worldview, it becomes religious.
We always said this, whenever a scientist is looking at data, it is the scientist with his or her own worldview that's interpreting that data. Right. So even the interpretation of the data is not scientific, right. It's religious in nature because it's going through somebody's worldview. So, and we'll probably get into this more in the next session as far as the politicization of this, because really it's a merger of Marxist ideology and Freudian ideology that we're facing in American culture today. It is the radical sexual revolution that is now being enforced through government power. Mm-hmm. Again, I used to get amazed at how our government agencies are exploiting this basically Freudian sexual theory across the globe, pushing the LGBT, pushing abortion on demand, pushing contraceptives and safe sex and all that agenda, pushing this at all these countries that do not share those values, many of them, again, coming from Christian roots. Why was America doing all of this? Well, it's because those in the elite group who buy into this kind of ideology are pushing this agenda. Yeah. Why the sexualization of our kids? Why sex why sex in all the marketing? Yeah. This is all Freud screaming at us today from his grave. Yeah. And it's just important for us to understand this. So anyway, next week we're gonna pick up a very, very important issue, because on the heels of the destruction of all sexual morality comes obviously an attack on the traditional family. Yeah. And of course, Christians believe the traditional family is the cornerstone, the building block of healthy societies. And why is it that people attack marriage between a man and a woman as a safe and healthy, and in fact as the best place for raising the next generation of young people? We're going to see again a radical fusion between Marxist thought and between Freudian thought as it relates to sex, and really a movement in our culture today arguing from economic liberty or economic equality to really today we're finding a massive expression of sexual expression rooted in civil rights kind of language. Yeah. Identity. Civil rights is identity. Identity politics.
Identity politics, yeah.
And it will help us understand why we're in the mess that we are politically.
I just got one more point to add to this whole thing. I think a very simple way to think through this is, what is the fruit of this? Just look, you don't have to even talk about sociological. Just look at the lives around you, the people around you. Oh, yeah. What is the fruit of this indulgent into your sexual desire? Elevate that as the number one desire, the prime desire that leads all other desires. How has that worked out for us as a culture? Yeah. How has that worked out for maybe your friends or family or who people you know? Yeah. How has that worked out? No,
it's a good point. Hey, you look at the biblical conception of sexuality as a beautiful thing. It's a holy thing. Yeah. It's something that is a sacred expression between a man and a woman who have made a covenant with each other for their lives. It is something powerful. So the Bible's certainly not anti-sex, but just what you talked about. Look at the tragic result of sexual expression outside of any moral boundaries.
Yeah, there's lust for all kind of things, for money, for greed, for sex, for power. All these different desires, and pick and choose. But whenever those desires are elevated beyond our prime desire, which ought to be God, which we talked about this, right? Yeah. This is what happens. Yeah. So again, simply look at the fruit. Simply look at the results and say.
Well, you and I both taught classes on philosophy and Christian thought. You can go back and look at the philosophers used to ask the question, "What is the best life?" or "What is the good life?" Yeah. What does that look like? And you go all the way back to like Aristotle. He believed that the virtuous person was the good life, the person who lived by virtue. You go back to, again, Christian philosophers, and they'd say, the good life is a life that is a life pleasing to God. Yeah. And that produces harmony with God, harmony with people. And then we've gone all the way down to where now simply a base lust, a desire for sexual, satisfaction. Yeah. I think of the Rolling Stones. I can't get no satisfaction. So much of the music today it's not about love. It's about just raw sexual desire, and it's ugly, it's crude, it's perverted, it's callous, it's just gross.
And where is the place for pleasure or happiness that comes from self-sacrifice? Because there's a deep sense of like, why would soldiers go to war then? If they're deep into their deepest desire is sexual fulfillment. That's who they are. You tell them that's who they are. Why would you go to war and protect your country, lay your life down to protect your country? Why would anyone do that? Why would some business owner...
What pleasure is there?
What pleasure is in sacrificing himself? Why would a business owner work hard so that he can provide for his community, so he can serve and build infrastructure, versus just, hey, collecting wealth and become greedy and satisfy his appetites? Why should anyone be motivated to do any of those virtuous things that we often criticize people for, when the philosophy we're putting on people is really at the root core who you are, is expression of this carnal desire that's really about you. We're throwing paradoxes left and right, and we're wondering why we don't have scrupulous business guys, or we don't have virtuous people who lay their lives down, you know? So it doesn't make sense to me.
The proof is in the pudding. You know, a worldview that is true will produce amazing fruit. Lasting fruit, beauty, goodness, virtue, blessing, satisfaction. A worldview that's not rooted in truth is going to lead to disastrous results. And wherever Freud and the Playboy lifestyle is lived out, with the one-night stands, the breaking of marital covenant, raw sexual pleasure, you know, that has a way of consuming a person. It leads to bondage. It does not lead to liberty. And so anyway, but this has been very helpful for me, because all of a sudden I get why people with PhDs are pushing sex education all the way down into preschool. Like, what kind of perverted thought is that? Well, I understand now. It's a perverted guy named Sigmund Freud who rejected God and who lived for his penis. All right, that's what happens. I shared Sunday. You know, I didn't use this language because there were children present, but you are more than your penis, which is really good news if you're a guy. So act like it, live like it. And don't be controlled by your sexual desires and pleasure.
There are greater desires. There's so much greater desires than that. So
we'll pick up this next week when we get into identity politics and why sex and politics are now merged together in America, and we have to figure out how to deal with it and how to combat it. So hope you'll join us next week. Until then, have an amazing week. Let's live for the glory of God and maximum pleasure in Christ.